QSO Today, episode 206, David Finell N7LRY. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of high-quality HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of ham radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX HF transceiver kit for under $50. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth4Z1UG, your host. My guest today describes himself to his future wife as a mad scientist coming from a ham radio family that encouraged deep learning of the subjects that interested them. David Finell N7LRY shares his ham radio journey, his deep dive into electronics through a career in the U.S. Air Force, and his interest in antennas that led to his helix VHF antenna design, as well as his leverage of ham radio skills to his other hobbies. N7LRY is my QSO today. N7LRY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, David?
Yes, I am. This is N7LRY, David.
David, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I was more or less born into amateur radio. I've been going to Hamfest since I was in diapers. My dad was a very, very active amateur radio operator and still is. And through his involvement in amateur radio and electronics, that's basically what was the largest influencer of myself, how I got into the hobby.
And what's your dad's call sign?
His call sign is W7EFQ.
And does he live in the San Antonio area, which is where your current QTH is?
No, he lives in Phoenix.
Great. So tell us about that then. Where did you grow up, and how did it progress from there?
Okay, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and as I said, I've been exposed to amateur radio since I was very young. One thing that I probably remember the most is going to the Fort Tuthill Hamfest, which was held in the Coconino County Fairgrounds in Flagstaff, Arizona, every year growing up. And that was, to me, I thought that was probably better than Christmas or the holidays, just because I really enjoyed all of the technology. I always saw all of the test equipment with all the knobs, dials, buttons, screens, and all of that really fascinated me, even though I had no idea what any of it did or meant at the time.
Do you remember other kids your age at these Hamfests?
Yes, I do, and some of them were rather unique. This Hamfest had some kids that actually drove unicycles around the Hamfest, but this was a very huge Hamfest. But I do remember a couple kids riding unicycles around the Hamfest. The Hamfest also had a very old steam locomotive there that the kids would use as a jungle gym, which was an absolute blast. But unfortunately, kids growing up tend to get hurt and stuff, and there was an incident where a kid fell off the locomotive and I think broke his arm or something of that nature and caused a little bit of a liability issue, so they ended up first fencing it off and then hauling it away, which I was very disappointed about because, you know, some sorts of injuries like that are just part of growing up. And I think it's sad that kids these days don't have opportunities of that nature just because of how litigious the society has become.
Yeah, I pushed my granddaughter up on a roof yesterday to fetch a ball, and her mother came out and says, "Oh, that's terrible. It's so dangerous." And I looked at her. I said, "I bet you were on the roof a lot when you were a kid." She says, "Yes, I was." And I said, "Well, give your granddaughter a chance to experience a little danger." So I hear this. I think that's probably why most diving boards on public pools are now have gone the way of the locomotive.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because I think the kids are losing a lot of opportunities to learn and push themselves that we had growing up. I think a lot of the opportunities they had and a lot of experiences that we have that we can draw from are being denied kids these days.
Right, like a little danger, adventure. You know.
Well, not just a little danger, but also not just a little danger. A lot of hobbies that I'm interested in, and I know other amateurs are interested in as well, because for some reason I think amateur radio goes along with a lot of other technically related hobbies. I see a lot of hobbies drying up just because these days kids are not exposed to these hobbies or are not having any interest in them because of social media and other interests that they are exposed to that we did not have growing up.
Yeah, I think that's a great conversation. I think we'll return to that a little bit later because I think I'd love to hear your perspective on that. When did you get your first license, and how old were you?
I think I was around 17 or 18. I got it in, I think, around 1987, 1988 time frame. And I took an amateur radio class through the local amateur radio club with a friend of mine. And this is back in the days when you needed to know code to get your license. And I remember passing the code portion of my exam before my friend. He passed his written before I passed mine, but everything worked out there. But it was about that time frame when I first got my novice license.
I see. And what was your novice call sign?
KB7FPO, Foxtrot Papa Oscar. And I had not received the license in the mail yet by the time I went to the Fort Tuthill Hamfest that was coming up. And I tested again for the technician using my certificate of successful completion at the Tuthill Hamfest. And I earned the technician license there, and with that I requested a new call sign to get a shorter call sign, which is the call sign that I currently have today.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And having grown up in a household with a ham radio operator, was your first time on the air with your new license, was that any different than it was when you were on the air with your father?
I really wasn't on the air a whole lot with my father. I think I was only on the air once or twice with my dad being the control operator growing up. Unfortunately, my dad's work kept him very, very busy, and he did not have the opportunity to really teach me a whole lot about amateur radio or electronics. He did teach me some of the basics of soldering when I was going through electronics class in high school, but unfortunately his job kept him so busy that I missed out on a lot of that opportunity, which I'm a little bit disappointed about, but I also understand the situation he was in.
Did you have any other mentors or Elmers who helped you along?
I learned electronics the most from the Air Force. I had an electronics class in high school, but unfortunately, the high school I went to, the kids weren't that interested in the class and just using the class opportunity to goof off because it was considered a shop class or an industrial arts class, and the teacher also didn't know electronics as well as he should have for teaching the class. So most of the electronics I learned was after I joined the Air Force, but because of my interests, I actually used the electronics I learned in the Air Force to help my amateur radio career, which also turned back and helped my Air Force career quite a bit. So
we'll get there in just a second then. Before we go on, did you have your own first rig, or did you operate your father's station?
Well, my very first radio of mine was a ICOM 2AT VHF handheld, one of the very first synthesized handhelds that had thumb wheels on the top. It didn't have any type of LCD display or anything like that. It was an outstanding radio. Build quality was fantastic. So that was my very first radio that I actually called my own. I didn't do a whole lot with HF at the time because only having the Technician, or what was later called the Technician Plus license, didn't have a whole lot of HF privileges. My first HF radio that I did have was given to me by my dad shortly after I joined the Air Force, and it was a Kenwood TS-180. And that was a decent radio. At the time, I didn't understand. It was a pretty old radio at the time, and at the time I didn't understand how some of the newer radios that were physically much smaller could do more than this radio. But it was a good radio, and from that I progressed to a TS-440, which also was an outstanding radio, and sold that a while back, and I've had a few other radios that go from DC to daylight. And my current HF radio is an ICOM 756 Pro 2.
And that's still a very popular radio, from what I see when people are trying to buy them on eBay.
I don't know how popular they are, but I'm very happy with it. I only purchased it a little short time ago. I normally do most of my stuff VHF and UHF. I don't do a whole lot of HF, but my dad got me as a birthday gift a very nice HF SDR kit last year, and that brought me back into the HF interests part of the hobby, and that was a very, very fun build. I really enjoyed building the kit. I enjoyed doing a lot of this was the first kit where I actually had an opportunity to do a whole lot of surface mount soldering, and I was really thrilled to find a kit that actually gave me that opportunity, and it was a very fun kit to build.
I actually have that in my questions, because you made a presentation to your local radio club about that kit. Given that was your first, was it your first experience with surface mount?
It wasn't my very first experience with surface mount. I had been through the Air Force's High Reliability Soldering and Connections course, which is a 2-week course that teaches you how to make the prettiest solder joints you've ever seen in your life. And I got experience with a little bit of surface mount there, and I also built a couple other very tiny kits, nothing like this, that had a couple surface mount components on it, but a large portion of the kits were through-hole. This was the first kit that I've built that the kit was predominantly surface mount, and I really enjoyed the opportunity and the challenge of assembling it, and I'm very proud of my work. The kit worked beautifully.
So tell me, do you have a technique or a secret or some advice that you could offer somebody that would build a surface mount kit like this for the first time?
Well, actually, I find surface mount easier than through-hole as far as the assembly process. Fixing it is a little bit more challenging if you screw up, but assembling it and actually doing the soldering is easy. And different components require different techniques. The way I soldered most of these small chip resistors, chip capacitors, is I would put a drop of flux on the board where the pads are, set the component on it, and then just slightly tin the soldering iron, and then touch the tin soldering iron to the edges of the component, and the excess solder on the soldering iron would just flow perfectly onto the components. The larger chips, the largest chip on this board had 100 pins on it. It was about the size of a penny, so it had pretty high density pins. That one there, in order to make sure that the registration of the chip didn't shift as I was soldering it on, I put it in place and I put liquid flux around it and let the flux harden a little bit to hold it in place, and then I tack soldered the the opposing edge leads, and then I used a technique where you tin the soldering iron and you swipe it down one side of the chip, and it flows the solder onto each individual pin.
Oh, that's amazing. So you're not using an air tool at all. You're just using a conventional soldering iron with a very fine tip. And
yes.
Well, that's very interesting. And you're using liquid solder or solder. I'm sorry. You're using liquid flux.
Yes, using liquid flux, and you also have to make sure you have the right type of solder. Solder comes in different alloys, and you use 6337 solder, which is also known as eutectic solder. And this type of solder is very good at preventing bridging, so it avoids bridging connections. The other popular alloy of solder is 7030 solder, which is also very common, and it is also a very standard solder, but it has more bridging capabilities. So you use the right type. You use the solder for what you're trying to do.
Right. So you should use 6337 solder, and you should use liquid solder flux. Wow, this is amazing. And because I've actually never heard of anybody doing it this way. So you don't use any hot air tools?
I have a hot air tool, but the hot air tool is primarily used for doing rework, where if you need to remove components that's the way I use it, is for removing components. For actually soldering the components on the board, I just use a conventional soldering iron.
What do you do if you have to take that 100-pin IC off the board and you're using your hot air rework station? How do you grab a hold of the top of the chip and pull it up? Is there some technique that you have?
Well, It depends on why you're removing it. If it's because it's a bad chip, the best way to do it is just to snip the leads, remove the chip, and then remove each individual lead, just using a soldering iron that way. If you're trying to save the chip and resolder the chip, what I would do, and I've never done this before, because I've never had to do any surface mount rework of this nature, but the way I would do it is using the tools that I have is I'd use hot air to heat up the chip itself and use some curved needle nose tweezers to lift up the chip after the chip is evenly heated up using the hot air. And they do make hot air attachments for specific chips that have clips on the hot air attachments, and that will heat up the leads around the chip, and you can lift it up that way as well.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. You list on your QRZ page all of your hobbies, which is actually quite amazing. You do ham radio, electronics, home brewing, photography, radio-controlled vehicles, mostly sailboats, lasers and holography, music, astronomy, astrophotography. You're a marksman with a 10M air pistol, an air rifle?
A 10-meter air pistol.
A 10-meter air pistol. That's the range of the slug?
Yeah, well, that's it's an Olympic sport. It's not televised that often, but they have a couple Olympic shooting sports that I have interest in and that I do as a hobby, and it's 10-meter air pistol and 10-meter air rifle. And these are very, very safe guns, but incredibly accurate. They're not your typical air guns that you can get at your local stores. Most of these come from Germany or Switzerland and are very fine crafted.
So they're special order.
They're special order and extremely accurate.
I see.
And unfortunately not cheap.
Well, the other thing you said that you do is horology, HOROLOGY. What is horology? I've never heard of it.
Okay, horology is the technical term for a person who's interested in time and timekeeping devices, clocks, watches, this sort of thing.
So do you rebuild clocks, or do you have some certain kinds of clocks that you like?
I have rebuilt clocks. I've done some work on some smaller works, like very large watches and stuff of that nature. I like a lot of timepieces with a lot of what are called complications, and that's where you have additional features other than the standard time, and they have a lot of gears. I love the fine workmanship that go into a lot of these very fine timepieces, the mechanical engineering and stuff. And there's one specific one that I'd absolutely love, but I don't think I'll ever be able to afford. And it's a watch that has a movement on it where the balance wheel is gimbaled on all three axes. And as it ticks, it spins itself on all three axes in order to even out the balance anomalies that are inherent with anything in order to provide extra accurate time for a mechanical timepiece.
So you have no fear of micro-miniature things, and that must be one of the reasons that you're so successful even with surface mount components.
I won't say that I don't have any fear. I've had a lot of failures, and I've never had any formal training as far as rebuilding watches. I've looked at a lot of videos and stuff of that nature about it, but a lot of my hobbies, actually most of my hobbies, are self-taught. So, but I was brought up in an environment, and this is one thing that I really am thankful about my parents, is that if we find something that fascinates us or interests us, they always encouraged us to learn about it, teach ourselves about it, and try it out. So, there's a lot of things that I've tried out and I've gotten into just because I've been interested in it, and I've decided to take the effort and learn about it and enjoy it.
I don't think I've ever asked this question, but I'll ask you because it brings something to mind. What magazine subscriptions did you have in your house as a kid?
I always remember seeing QST and QEX magazines from the ARRL. My dad's a life member of the ARRL, so I always remember those magazines. At one point, I had a subscription. I forget the name of the magazine, but it was a youth science magazine, I think, published by NASA or closely affiliated with NASA. And because I was very interested in space and aviation as well growing up, as I'm sure a lot of kids are. And so I think about a year subscription to that, but I don't know if the magazine quit or just my folks didn't have the money to continue subscribing to the magazine. I think it was more concern about money than anything. But we really didn't have a whole lot of magazines beyond that.
I see. You didn't have Popular Science or Popular Electronics?
I saw a lot of those magazines, but we didn't have them. I think my dad subscribed to National Geographic for quite some time because aside from being a ham, my dad was also a very skilled and prolific photographer as well.
And now this message from ICOM America. Summer is the time to hear it, work it, and log it. It's also the time to get an ICOM transceiver that is best suited for your amateur radio lifestyle. Last time we spoke about the IC7851, one of the finest competition transceivers in the market today. Today I want to speak to you about the IC7300 that has changed the paradigm for what an entry-level HF rig should be. The IC7300 is a high-performance and innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. The rig uses an RF direct sampling system with 15 discrete bandpass filters. It has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen display with a real-time spectrum scope. If you combine these features with a built-in automatic antenna tuner, 101 channels with 2 scan edges, full CW functions, and of course it works great on the digital modes, then you have eliminated most of the station accessories that you would normally buy for other entry-level HF transceivers. You save money and space. With the optional RSBA1 software, you can fully remote control this rig from your laptop over the internet. Did I say that this is ICOM's entry-level HF transceiver? Imagine what the amazing ICOM transceivers for the more experienced hams, like the IC7610 or the IC7851, can do. To find out more about these fine ICOM transceivers that will add to your summer operating experience, go to www.icomamerica.com. And when you make that ICOM purchase at your favorite ICOM dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Absolutely. Because of my experience with amateur radio and the electronics associated with amateur radio, I went into an electronics career field when I joined the Air Force. I joined the Air Force out of high school, and I started in the Air Force doing wideband communications. So basically working on communication systems that could send multi-conversations or avenues of communications over a single line. So we did a lot of multiplexing and stuff of that nature in my career field. And in the Air Force, the only constant is change, and my career field ended up splitting and merging, and I got to wear a lot of different hats in the various electronic career fields in the Air Force, so I had a lot of exposure to a lot of different electronic technology throughout my Air Force career. And the amateur radio definitely helped me with my Air Force career because it kept me involved in the electronics. And when it came time for testing for promotion, I scored number 1 in the Air Force in my career field for the electronics test that the Air Force gave. And that was without cracking any of the Air Force study material.
Now, you say you had a career in the Air Force. How long were you in the Air Force?
I was in the Air Force for 20 years. And when I retired, I was, in military terms, I was the NCOIC for radio and television systems for Headquarters Air Force News Agency. In civilian terms, I was the chief broadcast engineer for Headquarters Air Force News Agency.
I see. And what do you do now? In addition to ham radio and all your hobbies.
Well, I pretty much, after I retired from the Air Force, I went back to school. I got another degree in fine art with a concentration in photography. While in the Air Force, I earned a degree in electronics, so I now have a degree in fine art with a concentration in photography. And right now I don't have a formal job, but I do spend time giving lectures and elmering, and I started writing articles for QST, and I had an article published recently on an antenna that I designed. So I'm in the process of designing another antenna, basically the same type of antenna at a higher frequency, because I've been getting a lot of requests based on the first article to design another antenna at the 70 centimeter band. The antenna that I originally designed that was published in QST was a quadrifilar helix antenna for 2 meters.
Well, I actually have that as a question. What is a quadrifilar helix antenna? And by the way, so everyone knows, you won second place in the QST antenna design competition in 2017 for the VHF and above class of antennas. What is the quadrifilar helix antenna, and how does it work, and how is it used?
Okay. The quadrifilar helix antenna was theorized and invented by a Dr. Kilgus from Johns Hopkins. I forget the exact. It wasn't Johns Hopkins University, but there's another Johns Hopkins research lab. And the quadrifilar helix antenna, I got interested in it because I was interested in doing space satellite communications with amateur radio when I was living in an apartment complex. And most satellite antennas at the time required quite a bit of real estate and stuff that you couldn't really do from an apartment complex. And at the time, GPSs were first being introduced to the civilian market, and I had one, and I looked at the back, and I said it used something called a quadrifilar helix antenna. And I'm like, wow, a great big word. I have no idea what it is. Never heard of it before. So I did the research on it, and the quadrifilar helix antenna is, best way to describe it is two loop antennas oriented 90 degrees to each other around the same volume or space, but twisted a given amount. And the quadrifilar helix antenna can be designed in several different ways in order to shape the beam in a variety of different ways. So it has a lot of different applications for both terrestrial and space communications, and it's ground plane independent, and it has a fairly reasonable gain for the size. So it's the two loops are fit in phase quadrature, which means that if you have the four leads for the two loops, you feed it. The first loop is 0 and 180 degrees. The second loop is 90 and 270 degrees, and you feed it around in a circle at the feed point. And the phase relationship of the two loops, two twisted loops interacting with each other, create a circularly polarized radiation pattern.
Okay, so, and how are you using that antenna now? Are you using that with satellite communications?
I'm mainly using it just for terrestrial communications. It makes an outstanding antenna for both terrestrial and space communications because being circularly polarized, it can talk to or communicate easily with any linearly polarized antenna. And when you're dealing with situations like the hill country where I live in, or cities where you get a lot of reflections and can get the polarization changed with the bouncing off of the radio signal, the quadrifilar helix antenna really helps improve the propagation factors because it helps eliminate that being circularly polarized. And I live in a rather bad spot for hitting many of the repeaters at my current QTH here in town. And this antenna, I can, there's repeaters that I can't hit with an HT that I am full quieting with this antenna. And right now, this antenna is just sitting in my bedroom. So right now I'm mainly using it just for the local repeaters. Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, when I read your article, it got me to thinking that that might be a good antenna also for a repeater, as a repeater antenna. There was some, in one of the earlier episodes of the QSO Today podcast with Bert, K60QK, he had one of the early repeaters in Southern California, and he was talking about how he had tried a circularly polarized antenna on his repeater site, and that it was outstanding in terms of providing signal in areas you wouldn't think you would have signals, and very different than the vertically polarized antenna that people are used to using on repeaters. So when I saw your article, I thought, well, that might be interesting for the hill country that we live in here, where oftentimes you're driving down the road and you don't have a direct line of sight, and you're maybe close to the repeater, or maybe underneath it, and having a circularly polarized antenna might be the thing. Your article was what was interesting about it to me is that this is not an expensive antenna to build, although it looks to me like it requires some metal bending skill. Did you need any special equipment to bend the elements and some technique that you might have used in order to make sure that they came out all right?
Didn't require any special equipment. In fact, I used elements of the antenna itself to do the bending. The bending method that I used for the helical elements, I tried to communicate accurately in the article. And basically, you build a square loop antenna with two cross members and the helical strips, or the strips that will form the helixes, and grabbing the horizontal cross members, you push and twist. You push them together and twist at the same time, and that will create the helixes fairly evenly, provided that you don't tighten up the screws at the ends of the horizontal cross members on the antenna design, and that creates fairly even helixes for building these antennas. So that's the technique that I used. The most specialized tool that I used for building the antenna was probably just a tap and die set in order to cut the threads at the end of the aluminum rods. So that's about the most specialized tool that I used.
Well, it was a very interesting article, and I think one of the reasons I actually sent you an invitation to the QSO Today podcast, because I was intrigued with the antenna that you built and the antenna design, and I'm looking forward to seeing your this year's entry to see how it works on UHF. Is that what you're going?
Well, I'm going to be putting together an article for UHF. I don't think I don't think QST had a competition this year, or I did not see anything about it. They do not always have the same events or competitions each year. But I do plan on writing up the paper and seeing if QST will publish it. And I don't see any reason why they wouldn't for the 70-centimeter version. And I'm also planning on doing a couple different 70-centimeter versions because the band is so large. I want to cover different elements of the band, one for the repeaters, one for the satellites. And I'm also thinking of using another design of the quadriphilic helix antenna that will provide better gain towards the horizon for doing more, that's dedicated more towards terrestrial communications rather than space for those people who want to use it primarily for local repeater stuff. Or we have a group locally called the Hamsters that is into doing VHF and above single sideband and weak signal work, and I think it would work very nicely for that as well.
So in order to get gain on an antenna like that, what would you do, create stack another set of elements on it?
The antenna that I built there is a quarter wave, it's not a quarter wave, it's a half wave, half turn quadriphilic helix antenna. And the one that I have in the article there has an approximately 2-to-1 aspect ratio. If I take the antenna and increase the aspect ratio and make it a 1 1/4 wave, 1 1/2 turn antenna, and make it very long and slender, that will increase the gain towards the horizon.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out. That's for people that like to experiment with antennas, especially VHF and above. This sounds to me like a must-wait for article coming up in QST or wherever you publish it.
Right now I'm building the prototypes, and when you deal with higher frequencies, the tolerances are a lot higher, so it's going to take a little bit of work to try getting all the bugs worked out of the new antenna designs, but when I do, I will definitely be submitting the article to QST.
David, you and I were talking off microphone about a system called the Amber Alert system. Can you talk more about that?
Okay, what it is here in the U.S., and I don't know if they have the same thing over there in Israel, we have what's called the Amber Alert system, which is a network that will get words out if children are kidnapped and allow quick information spread to the public about what to look for if a child has been kidnapped in order to help recover kidnapped children. And around the Rocky Mountains, there was some problems with the Amber Alert network not having reliable communications between some of its communications nodes. And the manager for that section of the network was interested in trying to resolve the situation, and it was suggested that he try using the quadrifile helix antennas on some of his nodes. He was provided with a couple prototype antennas to see how they worked, and he came back and said he was so impressed he wanted to replace all of the antennas on all of the nodes with that antenna because of the dramatic improvement it made in the communications capability of the network.
Well, that's certainly inspiring and certainly a good reason to experiment with these antennas. As I say, you've inspired me to try it on a couple of the repeaters around here just to see if we can improve some of the coverage, in the canyons and the areas below the repeaters where oftentimes the beam of a vertical antenna, shoots over your head and hits the ground, miles away. So that sounds like a very interesting antenna. Regarding the Amber Alert system, I'm not aware of it. It's a system that transmits an alert message to what? To pagers? To
we have a lot of electronic street signs here, and they will come up on a street sign saying Amber Alert, silver Toyota, license plate such and such.
Really?
And it'll have a number to call if you spot that vehicle, and that'll get law enforcement out to intercept that vehicle to try recovering the child.
Wow. I've never heard of such a thing. How about that?
And they also do the Amber Alerts with scrolling text at the bottom of TV stations and over the public radio stations as well. So these are the avenues that the Amber Alert is distributed to the public. So if people see this vehicle, it says basically everybody keep an eye out for this vehicle. We're looking for this person. The child's life may be at risk.
So kidnapping is so big in the United States that it warrants building this is a national system?
It is a national system.
Wow.
And I don't know that kidnapping is that prolific. We do have actually, apparently it is. We have a lot of problems with child or people trafficking here in the United States for a variety of things. And actually, it's a problem all over the world, not just the United States. But we do have a fair amount of issues with it here in the U.S.
Wow.
And quite often, though, it is something like some estranged parents are having a custody battle, and one parent will take the child from the other parent. This is something that happens a fair amount of time, and that will also generate an Amber Alert.
And they're using a special system rather than using LTE or the cellular telephone networks as a way to put that data out there.
Part of the system is specialized. It's basically similar to the emergency broadcast system.
Oh, interesting.
But it does have some dedicated portions to it.
So these are VHF frequencies or UHF frequencies?
I do not know the frequencies that they operate at.
Oh, interesting. That's the great thing about this podcast is I learn something new every time I speak to somebody. And now this message from QRP Labs. Hans Summers, G0UPL, informs me that he has sold over 5,000 QCX transceiver kits. I hope that in large part this is due to the promotion on the QSO Today podcast of this amazing single-board transceiver kit for under $50 from QRP Labs. The QCX is a feature-packed high-performance single-band 5-watt CW transceiver kit with whisper beacon and built-in alignment and test equipment tools. It is available for 80, 60, 40, 30, 20, or the 17-meter bands. It has a rotary encoder synthesized tuning, VFO A-B split, iambic keyer, CW decoder, and more. You can assemble this kit yourself with standard tools and a soldering iron. There are no surface mount components to solder, as the two SMD ICs are already factory pre-soldered on the board. Of course, Hands has a whole range of accessories to trick out this ride, using the language of hot rod cars. Since Hands has shipped over 5,000 QCXs, there is a rapidly growing community of builders and users who are fine-tuning the QCX in an open-source kind of way and sharing it with us on the Internet. So if you're ready to build your own rig, or want to save money, or just want that prepper rig for your bomb shelter, use the link on this week's show notes page to get to QRP Labs. Please use my link, as it tells Hands that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now, back to our QSO Today. Now, you're a builder and a home brewer. What projects besides this do you have currently on your workbench?
Well, right now I try working one project at a time, and right now the antennas are what I'm working at. The other project that I completed right before the antennas was that solid state or that surface mount SDR kit, and that was the kit is called an MCHF. It stands for Mega Cheap HF radio, and for what it does, it is mega cheap, as the designer over in England says, and it's as I said, it's an outstanding SDR kit, very capable, QRP only, but it's remarkable what it does for the price.
Are you using it on the air?
I have used it on the air. I'm not currently using it on the air, but I have used it on the air, and I've spoken all over the United States with it. I haven't made any international contacts with it, but I have used it and made cues all over the United States with it.
Do you suppose it could be adapted to Whisper, multi-band Whisper transceiver?
Oh, I'm sure it could. I'm sure it easily could. The radio is, as I said, very capable. It has all of your traditional ins and outs. It's capable of computer control. It has two USB ports, part of it. They're always adding new modes built into it, and of course you can use any of the sound card modes with it real easy. So Whisper should not be an issue with it.
Do you have any test equipment on your bench, and what's your favorite?
Oh, I have gobs and gobs and gobs of test equipment. My bench, or my office, lab, shack, whatever you want to call it, looks almost like something out of NASA's Mission Control. Not quite, but I have a couple of oscilloscopes. I have HP 141T spectrum analyzer. I have a Sencor inductor impedance analyzer. Have a couple frequency counters. My favorite piece of test equipment that I recently picked up is a vector network analyzer, and it's a nice handheld unit, but very capable from China, and I use it for doing quite a bit of the antenna analysis. It does an outstanding job of telling me exactly what the antenna is doing and what adjustments I need to make to bring the antenna more into line.
So an antenna network analyzer is a two-port device, isn't that right?
It can be used as a one-port or two-port device. It can be used in different ways. They call it S11 or S12 or S21, depending upon what tests you are doing.
So you could, for example, connect it to two sides of a filter, in order to characterize a filter, for its
Absolutely.
frequency and bandwidth.
I've done that.
Yeah.
Exactly, and you can, do insertion loss with it. You can, I use the vector functions and generate Smith charts with it on the antennas. So that's how I use it when testing the antennas, and that's using just one single port on it. But you can use multiple ports on it for doing tests of filters and other devices.
You mentioned earlier that you're in Elmer for the radio club. You also do, you're a volunteer examiner. Do you have any sense from the people that you're Elmering and the people that are taking the test for the amateur radio license what you think the condition of ham radio is, at least in the San Antonio area?
San Antonio area is, we have several clubs in San Antonio, so the amateur radio community is fairly active here in San Antonio. Each club has its own personality and concentrates on different aspects of the hobby in various ways. There's some parts of the hobby that I do that none of the clubs do, like the telecommand of model aircraft, like the model sailboats that I'm interested in. But all of the clubs have a lot of stuff to offer, especially around Field Day, which is coming up. There's one club that typically concentrates on QRP. There's other clubs that concentrate on other aspects of Field Day for different points and stuff of that nature.
As you're a volunteer examiner and helping to Elmer new hams into the hobby, what are your thoughts on that? Are you seeing the non-ham public becoming interested in ham radio, and how does that look in San Antonio?
I'm seeing a lot of new hams being generated in amateur radio. The one thing that disappoints me a little bit, at least, is that most of them are getting into it strictly for, and it's my impression that they have the impression that amateur radio is primarily for emergency communications and are not aware of all of the other wonderful aspects of the hobby that they can use to enrich their knowledge and life as well. A lot of the amateur radios operators here are pretty much only interested in getting their technician license, and there's quite a few that are interested in the HF aspect of it, but most that I've seen are primarily interested in the very basic license for rudimentary emergency communications. But we are making quite a few hams, and hopefully these hams will be exposed to more aspects of the hobby and will grow with the hobby in the future.
What do the age ranges look like?
Well, the youngest ham, although it was when I was stationed in Abilene that I've ever administered a test to or gotten involved with amateur radio or Elmert, was about 11 years old. I have no idea the exact age range of the older hams that I've tested, but some of them are up in their 70s as well. There's one ham that that really got involved with amateur radio after getting his license, and I think it's funny that he says when he grows up, he wants to be just like me, and he's 30 years older than me. So I can't figure that out. But I'm one of the few hams active in the club that I'd say is less than 50, but not much. 50 is fast approaching. But I've been a ham for about 30 years. So, okay, but I see people getting into the hobby from all ranges, all age groups. Some got out of the hobby and are getting back in. Some are new hams, and there's no specific age range.
Well, you don't see a lot of kids coming into the hobby, do you think?
Most of the people coming in, I'd say, are at least in their 20s, at very least. I don't see a whole lot of kids. I see a few, but not that many. It's
a very different world than it was when we were kids, and amateur radio seemed to be more interesting.
I think that is a true statement, yes.
Now, you mentioned that you use ham radio to control your sailboats.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do to control your sailboats? What kind of controls do your sailboats have that would be different maybe from what you would buy in a hobby store?
Well, when I got into doing the radio-controlled sailboats, all of the radios, all of the commercially available remote control radios are all channelized, and you have a very limited number of channels that you can use for the command of model craft. So having the ham radio license and being able to telecommand model craft using the amateur radio frequencies gives you a lot more flexibility so you don't cause interference with other people using their models. So that's one of the big benefits of telecommand of model craft with amateur radio. And there were, and unfortunately there aren't anymore, several companies that would make radio controls at the amateur bands that you could purchase, and major brands like Futaba and I think Kraft made some, but and a company called JR. These used to be popular brands, and some of them still are popular brands for radio controls. And they used to make them for amateur radio frequencies, typically around the 6-meter band, but I've heard of people using other frequencies or other bands for telecommand of modelcraft as well.
Now, you can operate more, obviously more power with your license. Do you operate more power when you're controlling your sailboat? Does that have any advantage?
Actually, I think that you're not allowed to operate that much more power when you're doing telecommand of modelcraft. I think you're limited to 1 watt, if memory serves. But still, that is more than adequate for the modelcraft and the frequencies that we're using here. I have a small lake here in town in San Antonio, and I can sail the sailboat pretty much as far as I can see on the lake. Real easy, not a problem. So it's as long as I have line of sight to the sailboat, I have no problems controlling it.
Do you use APRS or anything like that on the boat?
No, I don't. I just use the basic radio control, and one of the main sailboat that I have that I'm controlling with amateur radio is called the International 1-meter class of model sailboats, and people can get pretty fanatical in that hobby as well. And this is a class that people have sailboat races with and will travel literally all over the world to race their model sailboats. So with the competitions in mind, you generally want to keep the weight on the sailboats as little as possible. So adding any little stuff like APRS or stuff that is not needed is generally not done.
Have you seen, or do you think that, given the electronics packages that are available on quadcopters, that some of those electronics packages might be adopted for use on the sailboats, including video cameras?
I don't see any reason why not. They easily could be. I've like a lot of different radio-controlled stuff. I have a couple quadcopters myself, not with video cameras on them, but just a couple drones that I've played with. I also have a radio-controlled helicopter. I've had radio-controlled fixed-wing aircraft. And there's no reason that this technology couldn't be implemented in a sailboat. But my big thing is that sailboats typically only require 2 channels. Maybe some of the sailboats a little bit more complex may require a little bit more, but generally you don't need the sophistication for sailboats that you need for a lot of your flying models.
Well, it seems to me it might be kind of fun to be able to, wear a heads-up visor or something like that over your eyes while you're floating the boat and actually like you're on the boat, cruising across the water without the seasickness.
Yeah, well, if you put the camera on a servo where you could actually look around, that could be useful, where you could judge your distance between your boat and the other boats. I could see that being potentially useful. Or
even some automation. You've kind of opened my mind up to what might be possible using remote control.
Well, believe it or not, the rules, I don't know how that would fit into the rules. I haven't looked at the rules recently, but the rules for controlling the sailboats and what is actually allowed to be on the sailboats are pretty tightly regulated. And you'd actually probably be surprised. Now, for just hobbyist fun, you can pretty much do anything you want with model sailboat. But if you're into the competitions, they don't want any of the boats to have what might be considered an unfair advantage. So the rules are very specific as far as what is allowed on the boats. And they even have restrictions as far as what decorations you can put on the boats as well.
Interesting. What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, before we were married, I told my wife that she was going to be marrying a mad scientist, and she was well aware of that at the time. And shortly after we were married, my wife did get her amateur radio license. She doesn't do a whole lot with amateur radio, but it's come in handy when we've had to do long road trips, taking separate vehicles when the Air Force has moved us from one base to another. And the amateur radio has been very useful in those situations, being able to talk between vehicles, saying, okay, let's take a break, pit stop here, this sort of stuff. Beyond that, my wife doesn't have a whole lot of interest in the hobby and pretty much lets me go off and do my own thing.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good arrangement. And I guess nowadays with cell phones, having the XYL with a 2-meter radio in the car is probably more the exception rather than the norm.
Well, possibly, but with the radios, it's a lot easier and a lot safer to use the radios than the cell phones, because if you're wanting to talk to another person with a cell phone, you have to look down, dial the number, or stuff of that nature, unless you have voice control, to talk to the other person. There's a lot of technology, a lot of new technology that I haven't adopted yet. A lot of it because I'm not interested in it, some of it because I have other things to do with the money that I do have. So it's I'm not completely up to speed with all of the modern cell phones. I'm actually pretty old school in that regard. I still use an old flip phone. I don't even have a smartphone. So, but for communicating between vehicles, I think amateur radio is still a lot better than doing a lot of your mobile devices or, cell phones and stuff that's more popular.
Yeah, I would agree. I now have a mobile in my car, and I like channelized. I like the fact that it's channelized rather than something where I would play with a display. It's just easier when you're driving and, to know that channel 2 is where you want to be.
Yep, completely agree.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think it's really neat that amateur radio is continuing to evolve. Amateur radio has always fostered innovation with communications and helped push communications along. And right now we're getting to the point where it's a push and pull. We're seeing some communications that are more advanced than amateur radio, and some amateur radio that is still at the forefront and pushing communications. So the amateur radio, I think, is fantastic that it's evolving with the times, adopting new technology, new communications modes. I remember when PSK 31 came out, and I learned about the mode, I was just amazed that you could actually use such low power to communicate worldwide fairly reliably just because of the narrow bandwidth used by PSK 31. And I think, a lot of that innovation is really exciting me, where we're actually creating more technology that will allow us to do a lot more with a lot less. In this case, a lot more communications with a lot less power than what we've done in the past. So that is probably what's exciting me the most, is the new communication modes that allow better communications through adverse or limited conditions.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. What advice would you then give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I'd give this not just to the hobby, but for pretty much all aspects. If you see something in the hobby that you find fascinating or interests you, learn about it and do it. And I also would encourage new hams to learn how things work, because I have found throughout my Air Force career and throughout my life, if you know how something works, it allows you to use that device or skill set or what have you to a lot more, to the greater extent of its ability, if you will. I don't know exactly how to phrase that, but if you know how things work, it gives you the opportunity to solve problems a lot better.
Well, I think you phrased it just fine, and I think that's exactly how I think I would have thought about it as well. Well, David, you've been a great QSO. I really appreciate your coming on board the QSO Today podcast with me. I look forward to your future antenna projects, and I'm very interested in your helix antennas, perhaps for repeater work as well. So with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being here. 73s.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with David. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N7LRY in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alexa, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.